Now that we have this basic DOP setup going for us, let's take a look at the pop source node and control our simulation using some of the attributes and settings available to us here. This pop source node is actually a great node to first figure out when you're trying to learn about particles and how to control things. So up at the top here, we have emission type, and it says scatter onto surfaces. What that means is that we have our plane, right? And I can show our plane by checking this little guide right here. We have our plane, and it's just going to pick random locations along this plane to spawn the particles. These locations that the particles are being spawned at don't necessarily have to correlate with where an existing grid point might be. It can just happen right in the middle of a face. And as a matter of fact, if I zoom in here, you'll see that I have a point that's just being scattered onto the surface. It doesn't really have to listen or pay attention to the points existing on the geometry. The other emission types available to us will pay attention to the geometry. For instance, if we have all points, it will take all of our points and use that as a basically like a small little emitter. So if I go ahead and press play, you'll see that particles now spawn from all the different points. If I say all geometry, it's going to then actually deform the geometry and keep that intact. We don't want that. And if I say points, it'll do something similar to the scatter, where it will pick a different point to spawn from, but it will actually base those points off of current locations of points on that grid. So anyway, that is what the emission type is referring to. Let's change this to scatter onto surfaces, and I'm going to turn our guide off just so we can see things a bit better. While we are here at the source tab, I might as well introduce to you guys this geometry source option. Right now it's set to use parameter values, and what that means is browse for a specific place in our SOPs to pick up the geometry. Right now it's set to our object rune geo attribute for map 1, and we browsed for that earlier as well, right there. But we can also use other things. We could say use first context geometry. And what that means is use whatever geometry is plugged into this first input. If we say use second context geometry, it will take the second input and read it from there. But most of the time, I actually end up using this use parameter values, like that. And as a matter of fact, I also want to show you guys that whenever you browse for a SOP location like this, it's actually a good convention to make yourself a null node. So I'm going to create this null right here. And null nodes, they don't do anything, actually. They're a node that basically does nothing. But what we use them for is to mark locations within our network. And in the future, we also use nulls to oftentimes hold custom parameters that we want to specify and all that. But anyway, whenever you bring it into the DOP network, you want to make this null, and we're going to call this grid out, just like that. I'm going to disconnect this from my DOP network because we don't need to have that attached. And now that I go inside of our DOP and I browse for this, you'll see that I have grid out right there. And it's very easy to see. And it's also common convention to use all uppercase letters when you do this, because as you browse for it, it's a lot easier to find it when it's all uppercase. So grid out is what you want to do. And that is what this geometry source in SOP is going to be referring to. We have that, and whenever scatter onto surfaces is selected, we also have this emission attribute down here available to us. And this is how we're going to control where our particles spawn. So right now, we don't have any attribute specified for our emission attribute. But what we can do inside of SOPs is define our own custom attributes that will be used to control whether or not points are allowed to spawn. Hold down Alt and left click this attribute from map to copy it. Hold down Y to disconnect, like that. I'm going to connect it, and instead of saying export attribute CD, which is our color, I'm going to say emission allow. And you can actually name this anything you want. It doesn't have to be emission allow. It could just be yes, or it could be, hey, I'm Tyler. No, let's not do that. Let's do emission allow, and then that will create our emission attribute. Now, if I go here in our geometry spreadsheet, you'll notice that just like our color, which got created by our first attribute for map, we now have this emission allow, and there are 3 values represented by R, G, and B on our bitmap, or by our texture map, right? So 0 is black, and close to 1 is white. Now, right now we have 3 values associated with this, because our texture map is represented with red, green, and blue, right? That's how we get colors with texture maps. It's a set of 3 values. And we're going to talk about this a bit more down the road, but I want to start introducing this whole idea now where we actually have different data types that we can use. This set of 3 right here is called a vector. In other words, a vector data is a set of 3 bits of information, in this case, RGB. Well, because we only need 1 value, we don't actually need a set of 3 to define where the particles are allowed to spawn and where they're not. Instead of using a vector, which is specified right here, let's use a float. And again, I'm going to cover this a lot more in detail in the future, but a float will simply allow us to make 1 set of information here. It's still going to hold the values that we need, but instead of having 3 like that, we've now consolidated down, and it's just a bit more organized that way. Anyway, don't let that confuse you for now. But we set this to float. We have emission allow. Now, inside of our DOP network, we can say emission attributes, and I could say emission allow, like that, and it will mask off our particles. Additionally, I could also just use this little drop-down arrow, and it'll automatically say, oh yeah, you have emission allow specified, so use that. And there you go. Awesome. So now if I press play, we have these particles, and it looks kind of cool. All right, so we have that, and now what I want to do is vary our color a little bit. If I go back to our SOPs, we can go back to this attribute for map 1, which is the first thing we specified. And instead of using this rune texture, I actually want to use this space texture that I prepared ahead of time for us. So space version 1, I want this to be the source of our color. And I just chose this space image here. You could choose any image you want, really. And I chose a space because it just has a decent variety of colors going on to kind of give us a semi-rainbow effect. And now, inside of here, if I press play, we now have a variety of colors, and it's only being spawned within that rune shape. Cool. In the next lesson, we're going to continue on with this, and I'm going to show you some more stuff.